Let me introduce you our next speaker, Jeff Higgins, founder and CEO from Human Capital Management Institute. And Jeff would be talking about using talent market data to create workforce intelligence. Is it correct, Jeff?
Yes.
Great. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Ross. Let's dive in. I'm the founder and CEO of Human Capital Management Institute, an organization that basically connects human capital or workforce data to business insights and results. So we're very practical, applied. So we're gonna cover a few case studies. We're gonna talk just a little bit about tools, but mostly about data. And so we have our own proprietary software called Solve, which is a workforce intelligence tool, which does combine both external and internal data, does some very powerful things, but we're not going to spend any real time on that today. Our main focus is on kind of the story and some of the potential use cases for advanced analytics data. In terms of my own background, over 30 years in human capital analytics, workforce planning, one could argue I was a very early adopter in that space, and that's because I transitioned over. I was a former CFO in an organization who crossed over into HR. Some might say got lost and ended up in HR. And they said, oh, and this was in a publicly traded bank financial services company. And they said, oh, we have a numbers person in HR. How do we measure this? How do we quantify that? And luckily discovered my true passion in life. So I'd always liked the data and the numbers in finance and accounting, but it never really struck the passion. Whereas, matching data to people and trying to quantify human capital, people, talent, workforce, if you will, really did strike the passion. So I have done a lot of work in that area over the last 2+ decades, including a lot of standard setting work around ISO, the International Organization for Standards, including a standard that everyone on this call should know about called ISO 30414. It is the beginning of what I would call gap accounting for HR. So generally accepted HR principles for measurement, how to measure and report workforce. And it's actually a very important standard around HR. And it's actually being referenced by the Securities and Exchange Commission in some of the future reporting requirements that they're going to be coming out with probably in early 2023. All right, so with that said, we're just going to have a few introductory slides and then we will dive into kind of the meat or the greater level of detail. Analytics maturity models. So this is a slight variation of a Gartner model. And again, we're going to talk more heavily about data and a little bit about tools, but it's always good to have the context. And so the context is really, where are you as an organization, or where are you on your own journey? Are you more in the sense and respond or predict and act? Most organizations are more in the sense of respond. We're reacting to what's already happened, or we're trying to solve problems that are ongoing and that management or organizational leadership is asking questions about, versus predicting and finding the solutions, or how to avoid, even better, how to avoid some of these problems. A friend of mine, a colleague, said, in a perfect world, you want your predictive modeling to be so good that you're always wrong, meaning you can predict a problem coming or something getting worse, and you're able to help identify ways to or interventions to mediate that or eliminate that, so you avoid kind of stepping in the hole or the pit, and thereby your prediction of stepping in the hole or the pit is wrong because you were able to avoid it. And that would be a true best case scenario. But you really want to get into what will happen and what's the best that could happen. How can we optimize given what we have in terms of time, budget, talent, etc. And so these are different levels of analytics maturity model, and we'll try to show you some examples that are in sort of those three larger balls that are scaling up and to the right. So external data, what kind of data do we need and why and where to get it? So I think more and more organizations are actually using and relying on external data, particularly from a talent and market standpoint. And of course, nothing has accentuated or accelerated that more, perhaps, than the pandemic. So that's why I put it kind of top center: disasters, health crisis, aka pandemic. But there were lots of pressures coming in on HR. And by the way, all things people are often HR, which means anything that's going wrong with talent is HR's fault. So if you work in HR and you didn't know that, you should, because that's you wear a bullseye above your head basically that says HR on it, which means everything wrong with the workforce is somehow HR's fault, unless you have data or proof showing that in fact the root cause of that issue or problem is somewhere else, which by the way, it is somewhere else. But if you don't have data and you don't have the analyses to show it, it somehow just often settles in on HR. This coming from someone who was in finance, and I used to be the finger pointer, and then crossed over to HR and worked a decade in HR, having the finger pointed at. So I've actually gotten to sit in different roles and really understand how that dynamic works. And I don't think management truly understands how they tend to kick things off to HR that they may not necessarily have full understanding of. But you can see all of these things: skill shortages, workforce demographics, offshoring, outsourcing, location, labor cost changes, globalization, external statistics and data, technology changes, other kinds of factors, industry and market specific, just to name some, not even all of the factors that influence HR and really drive a need to have a much more global and comprehensive view of workforce talent and market than ever existed in the past. Not to say it wouldn't have been good to have in the past, but it's much more becoming an essential or an expectation today than it used to be. All right, so here's a fun one. What does everyone think of when they think of, kind of HR analytics? Data everywhere. So are you the Woody where you go, sort of the OMG, or are you the Buzz where it's just a wonderful and exciting time and you can't wait to dive in to whatever it is, or perhaps a bit of both? Either way, neither is wrong because it can seem overwhelming, but it is really an open, sort of like a new world or a new galaxy to explore. Let's have some fun with it and talk for a minute. So what can external data help you figure out? Well, things that you're reading about and hearing about every day. By the way, just for those of you in the US, I know some people may not be in the US today, right now, but 56% of US citizens think that the United States is already in a recession. And yet, what does the data say? So, and by the way, perceptions often become reality, but are they reality? So if you look at GDP in the lower left, in the US, the GDP growth had very phenomenal growth over several quarters, and then 2 quarters of negative GDP growth, which for many economists would signal the definition of a recession. And yet the second quarter, Q2, was negative 0.6%. So you kind of go, well, really, how negative was it? It's almost a rounding error, 0.6%. If you round it, it'd be negative 1%. But if it was just a little bit less, you might round it down to 0. And Q3, so ending at the end of September, was actually 2.9%. So if we round that to 3%, pretty significant. That's considered good or normal GDP growth for the US. And so it's a strange time, and the power dynamics have shifted, or has it shifted back to employers? Most CHROs say their company are considering or cutting headcount. I would argue that in the new environment, we are in a new uncharted set of territory that I would argue modern economies have never seen before. And what is that? Well, that is things like a perception of a recession, or as so many organizations and media companies predicting recession's coming. In fact, they literally print that every week. Technically speaking, it's probably not quite here, even though many companies, including some of the world's biggest tech companies, are cutting back. Stock market in the US is down, but not all stock markets are necessarily down. But everyone's predicting downturn next year. Will that happen? Who knows? But where we are today, and I can't necessarily predict recession or no recession, but what I can do is read all the data and say that this is a very unique situation, which is that GDP growth is still growing. People are still spending money. Confidence in many areas of the market, which is the private sector consumers, which powers most economic growth, is still strong. And there are more than 10 million open jobs in the US today. If you go back to pre-pandemic, a normal level of open jobs would have been 5 to 6 million. So we're still at nearly double the number of open jobs that used to exist in the US marketplace in the past. And the fact is, and this is also a dynamics, apologies, I don't have it in my charts, But there's actually the US and some other advanced economies, Canada to name one, actually have, Germany to name another, actually have a talent shortage. They simply do not have enough talent. And I'm not just saying just educated talent, educated, highly experienced, super highly specialized skills and job roles. Yep, that's been the case for years. They simply do not have enough qualified workers for many of the job roles that exist today. Hence 10 million open jobs, even though companies are cutting back, because normally companies are cutting back, number of open jobs declines, number of terminations or voluntary turnover drops, everyone stays put and kind of waits out the recession. That isn't happening. So that's why we're in a unique situation. In fact, this could be one of the least, I guess, human capital or job cutting, restructuring, intensive recessions we've ever had, if it is a recession, in fact. And I would argue those companies that are doing what they've always done, which is to cut jobs, are making a mistake, because talent today is so hard to get. When you have a scarce commodity like talent, the last thing you should do is to cut it to save money, because when you try to add it back later, when things get better, you might end up paying a heck of a lot. In fact, you probably will end up paying a heck of a lot more for it, and you wouldn't be able to get back the same talent you had. So hopefully you're cutting really, really poor performers. Otherwise, you're making massive mistakes, and you're probably going to give all that you're saving by reducing workforce in the short term back in the long term. Interesting time, but using all this external data, you can get a lot into that. So let's jump right into an example. What can you do from a tools and data standpoint to quantify something that's really hard to quantify? And again, we've got some charts here trying to make the very complex relatively simple and straightforward. We've got a dashboard here, which really shows how do you measure something like leadership's effect on business and business impact? Is our leadership doing a good job or not? And perhaps more importantly, what's the difference between a good leader? How do we quantify the difference between a great leader, a really good leader, like our top 25% of leaders, versus our bottom 25% of leaders? And you can see some ROI numbers on the left. And by the way, green numbers are good, red numbers are generally bad. You can also see comparisons generally versus prior year, meaning what's the trend? Doesn't matter if you're red, but if you're improving year over year, that's a good thing. If you're declining year over year, that's a bad thing. You don't have to be a math or a data science genius to figure that out. And then probably the most impactful and most important chart here is actually on the top right. And this, by the way, this is a variation of what's called a talent management index, an index of metrics that measure managers not on their own individual personal performance, but on how their employees operate. So we're measuring the effects and the transactions and the impacts on their employees when they work for that manager. So in this case, it's promotion rate. By the way, the same thing you can do for 6 other metrics: turnover rate, new hire employee, new hire retention rate, engagement rate, high performer rate, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll show you a little bit more on those metrics there. And you can actually see some of them in the middle left there that show some of the specific individualized metrics. So what those show is the red line is the bottom 25% of the workforce, the bottom quartile. The top or green line, so we differentiated and color-coded for a reason, is the top performing managers. So the top 25% of managers, they promote their workforce a lot more than the bottom 25% of managers. They also have much higher engagement scores, much lower turnover rate, more highly engaged workers, more high performers, basically more. What the difference between great leaders, the top 25% and the bottom 25%, if you look at it, is actually $19 million, which is the top left number. Pretty interesting and pretty valuable for leadership, because leadership always likes to say, oh yeah, our great leaders are much more valuable. How much? No idea. Well, what if we could quantify that? What if we could integrate all this data? So this is the power of some of these tools. And this is a dashboard style of consuming the data, but you can see the data is really amalgamated, integrated, and curated through some algorithms and what we call an index metric, which is a weighting of 5 or 6 different metrics to come up with an overall talent management index score, which, by the way, is 58.4, and you can see it on the left. Well, what else does this mean? What else could we do with it? Well, you could basically take a more qualitative problem and turn it into a quantitative solution or a quantitative score, which is you have your theoretical manager A, manager B. Both of them get the job done. In fact, if you read the top bullet point for both of them. They both exceed business goals. Great. Manager A, they only hire experienced people. Why? Because we don't have time to train. Why? Because we got to get, work, work, work. I don't have time to send people to training. So relatively high turnover rate. If they don't make it, they're out. Low mobility. If you are good, you're staying there. You're not going to get promoted or moved anywhere. Mixed performance for perhaps obvious reasons. Low engagement, because your reward, if you're a good performer under manager A, is a ball and chain connected to your desk, even if you get to work from home, hybrid, meaning you're not going anywhere. Why? Because you help that department and that manager be successful. Versus the approach of manager B, also exceeds business goals, hires less experienced, perhaps more junior people, or certainly willing to, trains the team personally, gets much more involved in ownership in terms of getting them trained and up to speed, lower attrition, but lots of churn. So more transfers, more promotions. People are often getting pulled out of there or promoted out of there into other departments. High employee performance, very high engagement. Why? Because everybody, the employees and other managers, know where to go to get good talent. Manager B is a great curator, a talent scout, a coach, a mentor, a great developer of talent. Manager A is a get the job done, leaving a wake of, so to speak, human capital carnage in its path, meaning a lot of people that are disengaged, maybe they even have health problems, high turnover, and high cost. And by the way, ultimately, management often doesn't care whether you're manager A or manager B. Shocking? No, I speak the truth. Management doesn't care about A or B. How do we make them care more about B than A? Manager B has a lower cost of workforce, and they create more long-term human capital value, workforce productivity, and value for the organization. That makes management care. Otherwise, the fact that all they care about is the first bullet point, that the job gets done, which is very short-sighted. The good news is that's starting to change. And you can actually use tools that will show you more about that. Apologies, I'm showing, there's a tool down at the bottom where you can actually score every individual manager in your organization if you have this kind of index data. Kind of like holding up the scorecards there, you see on the top graphic on the top right, who are your best managers and then why? And who's the best person or the best trainer for that is get a pool of some of those best managers and share some of their best practices for how they communicate, how they motivate, how they hire, how they promote, how they develop. Share that wisdom with the lower scoring managers, because oftentimes the lower scoring managers mean well, but they don't know what they don't know. And they may never have had the right kinds of training to be able to do those best practices that some of the really top managers do. Or maybe some of those best managers were just naturals. They never took the training, but they figured it out. Share those best practices with the other managers, and you can raise everybody up a level of performance. I could talk our whole time about leadership, because it's an area we've literally never failed to find ROI when we've been asked and provided data. I've got an audience question for you. Please take your time. I'm going to move through pretty quick through it, just so we can stay on track with our presentation. But do you utilize external market data to assess talent demand, supply, local, regional, global level? If so, what kind of data do you use? Please feel free to put something in the chat if you'd like. And we can go off of that. I'll give it just a few seconds. And now I'm giving you the spoiler. What kinds of external market data are there? Well, there's external job talent demand data, which is most often obtained by doing what's, I guess, increasingly be called data scraping. You can go in and scrape data from job boards and other kinds of data scraping information. Oh, thank you, Tamika. So ESMI and BLS data. Yep. So BLS is a great, by the way, the second bullet point in the US, a great level, and state level data, as well as even some local data, has some fantastic data sources you can use, which is in the supply category. How many graduates are there? How many people employed in different kinds of job roles? And from a demand standpoint, matching up that supply and demand data can be really, really valuable to utilize and blend in terms of making decisions. And then the third bullet point is of course, compensation data, which I think most of HR uses today. So if you thought you weren't using any external data, in fact, you probably are and have been for a long time in an organization, because most organizations do subscribe to various kinds of compensation benchmark surveys or online tools like salary.com. The good news is that's great data. The bad news is depending on what kind of data you're getting, it could be a little bit older, especially in a really hot market, or it could be a little more recent, depending on what kind of tool and what kind of provider you're using. But it's very powerful when matched with supply and demand data. And we're going to get into some examples of that in just a minute. What other kinds of data are valuable? Well, you saw me talking about some of the other economic data, which you might think is not important, but it is. If you're looking at what we might call where can we find talent in today's hybrid or full remote, in some cases, workforce options and opportunities. If you may be looking, instead of looking at the locations where you've historically been based, you may be able to now look across the US, across North America, across the world for where to find good talent. Barring or perhaps some limits around time zones, but otherwise, where can we go to get that great talent? And when you do that, you also need to take into account long-term growth rates like GDP. Is it a rapidly growing or a slow growing economy, or even the geometric area? What's the inflation rate? What's the unemployment rate? And what are some of the employment labor laws there as well? If you hire somebody, do you have to pay them 2 years of severance to let them go? Or do they have to be an employee, or can they be a gig type worker or a contractor? What kinds of flexibility do you have in some of these different countries? So all of that does come into play. And then, of course, HR benchmark data. So various metrics, what's the normal level of attrition in a particular geometric area and hiring rate? So how hot and how challenging is that market? And also, you could also think of cost of living, wage inflation. All of these would be important factors, whether you're calling it basically city, state, or country level economic data versus HR metric data. And then lastly, there's other areas, and this is pretty broad, so just a few examples: customized external data like competitor data. So wouldn't it be great to not only know where's the best place to go, but where are my competitors, and do I want to go be right next to them so I can steal their talent, or do I want to get as far away from them as I can so I don't lose talent to them, and they don't try to take my talent? So it depends on what your business strategy is, and also what's your workforce productivity. There are even culture metrics that you can get online with different kinds of subscriptions and tools. So there's a really amazing amount of information that can be obtained from external data. And then the most valuable use of external data is not just the external data itself, it's blending it with your own internal data. That's where you really unlock the value, because you want to compare, how do we stack up in this location? How do we stack up in pay? How do we stack up in talent? Are we fishing in the right place or the wrong place in terms of looking for talent? So external demand, let's talk about that one for a minute. Top tech companies. And by the way, all the top tech companies are cutting. So you can see some of the samples of job postings in terms of predicting and preempting talent competition. Where is most of the competition? Historically, it's been more in California, but as you can see, it's actually migrated to other areas in the eastern US and the far northwest in the Washington area as well, Seattle area primarily. So where can we go to find that best talent for technology? And we're gonna dig more into that in just a minute. Another piece of the story we want to talk about, and this does line up with what Alec Levinson was speaking before. By the way, I'm not necessarily a full believer in what he was saying, which is that there's an absolute need for both qualitative and quantitative high-level work. That is a good, very thorough way to do consulting. But I would actually argue that if you get the right kinds of data, you can cover off the quantitative and the qualitative very, very well. Because sometimes qualitative can lead you down the wrong path. In fact, when I was in finance and accounting, complete aside, I used to actually get tasked with coming in and cleaning up after some of the projects and decisions that were made from McKinsey and Bain consultants that seemed great, and management bought into them and signed off on them. Then found out later they were actually wrong, and there were $1 million cost implications associated with that. You mean the big multi-million-dollar consulting firms can be wrong? Yep, all the time. Because they're mining that internal data, which sometimes has some, is often fact-based, but at the end, it's not necessarily statistically valid. And if they miss one key factor, the whole analysis, like a house of cards, could fall apart. So what do you need as a part of that? So blending some qualitative is good. And I would argue the best use of qualitative is part of telling the story. Use the data to build your model. Use the data to drive all the decision making. But you need some qualitative to give context and build the story. And so the elements of a great story are, it needs to be persuasive, credible, emotional, actionable, and simple. We don't have time to dig into all of these. I'm going to dig a little bit into the actionable. And simple is really just boil it down, less and less jargon. Try to use fewer visuals instead of a ton of visuals. Don't make a big long deck. You can have as much supporting material as you want, no limits there, but try to keep your primary content and, so to speak, your money slide or story very short and very brief. And then avoid tunnel vision, is just over focus on one thing and ignoring others, and do link it to business impact, meaning tell management what it's going to cost them if they do nothing, or that there's a huge ROI if they do this. Those are some of the great ways to reach that tipping point. All right, so what makes a good story? As I said, we're going to just dig into the actionable for a few minutes, which is having told a good story or having a good data set is not enough. You need a great story. So for example, making it actionable would mean for literally boil it down to almost per person level if you can. The business can save $10,000 per position in hiring our next 3 to 5 or 30 to 50, depending on your size and scale, in this new location, or changing the kinds of skill sets that we're requiring to hire. By the way, companies, there is something called job requirements inflation, which means when managers don't know what they need, they always ask for more, with the implicit assumption that more experience, more education equals better performance. In fact, it can often have the opposite. In fact, usually does have a negative effect, because you end up hiring somebody who may be overqualified for the role. And the only thing worse than hiring someone who's underqualified is hiring someone that's way overqualified. They may not be challenged, they may be bored, they may be immediately looking for other things to do, or they may leave quickly, or all of the above. So actually trying to ask for more, and oh, by the way, asking for more also guarantees one thing, which you will for sure get, which is more cost. So it guarantees more cost, doesn't guarantee more performance. In fact, the best way to build a high-performing organization is to have levels scoped at just the right level of experience. In fact, sometimes just a little bit of stretch, so that people can grow and they feel stretched and challenged in the role, not bored or undermined or restricted. All right, so without further ado, let's jump into an actual case study. So we thought we'd show you a story of using internal and external data blended for a job that's really hard to find. This is kind of a fun one to talk about: cybersecurity analysts or experts. So this is one of those jobs for which there's probably 2 open jobs for every person who's actually qualified to work in that area. The biggest consumer of cybersecurity type jobs, particularly with any kind of clearance, is the United States government, perhaps unsurprisingly. But there are lots of really, really large employers like Amazon, like Google, who also use a ton of that kind of skill set. But the kind of the largest area, the largest concentration of that talent is on the far West Coast and the far East Coast, unsurprisingly. This is some of the different kinds of competitors. Remember, I mentioned when we talk about what kinds of external data, what's really, really, when we're taking that data from data into raw intelligence, we need to know who's hiring that. So when we say demand, who's hiring it? It's not just knowing what the demand is. That's interesting, but not actionable. Who's hiring it is potentially actionable, because again, if you know where they're based and where they're hiring, you know if you're going to steal from them, you know where you'd want to go or where you'd want to target for recruiting. If you want to, or if you want to stay away from them, you'd know where not to go. We want to make sure we go somewhere else so that they're not stealing from our pool of talent. And by the way, being geolocated right next to a competitor is definitely a two-edged sword, because you can, on the one hand, you can steal talent, but if they raise their wages, they can often steal it right back. It's a great win for the employees, not so much of a win for either of the competitors. So this is some interesting data. And by the way, there's more insights on the far right, but those are sort of hazed out a little bit to protect the guilty. Here's another way to look at it, another way to think about it, which is, what if we could do this by geolocation? And what we have is, you see a dual axis chart here. Labor concentration from low to high is on the horizontal axis, and the average salary is on the vertical axis. So vertical axis is really easy to understand. Who's paying the most? Horizontal axis is actually the most powerful and insightful, meaning where is there the most talent relative to the population. Now there's a third variable here, because you see a dual axis, but there's a third variable, which is the size of the ball. The size of the ball is the population of cybersecurity analysts and skill sets relative to the population in that geometro area. So the biggest population relative to the overall population of the area is District of Columbia, Washington area. However, you can see there's some other. Maryland, Baltimore is very close by to that. Maryland, California sounds the same, but it's actually very, very distinct and different. So where might you want to go to look for talent at a reasonable cost here? So quick quiz, are you paying attention? Anyone want to put into the chat, where would you go if you were going to look for cybersecurity professionals, especially if you were just going to look for a few? And by the way, there's some numbers you can see on the far right by different locations in terms of average salary. Anyone? I'll give you 5 seconds. Okay. Well, where I would go would be probably Bloomington, Illinois, or Maryland, California. Why? Because they're the far right in terms of labor concentration, meaning relative to the population, there's a great talent supply or labor concentration. Doesn't mean there's a ton of them. Size of the ball tells you how many there are. But if you're only going to hire 3 to 5, great place to go. If you're going to hire 300 to 500, okay, probably not the best locations to go, because you would probably drain the whole talent pool there. But they're also very middle of the pool in terms of labor cost. So they're relatively low cost compared to that. Where else could you go if you're really on a budget? Maybe Tallahassee, Florida. They have a decent supply, and they're second lowest cost overall. In fact, you see a couple of different Florida locations are super, super, super low. And if you're absolutely on a bottom budget, maybe San Angelo, Texas, although again, not a huge pool of talent opportunity if you're trying to save money. So you get the idea. And so this is actually, I would argue, by just putting the data in this kind of a style, you actually have turned this into something which is actionable by the business. They could make decisions about where to go hire talent and where to not hire for talent. But there's another way you can make this even more useful, which is, what if we compare demand and supply? So while you saw a huge ball and you might have been attracted to, oh, look at that huge ball of talent in the Washington, D.C. geometro area, that's where we should go. That's where the most talent is. Yeah, but that's the pond that every other competitor and the U.S. government is fishing out of. Everyone is recruiting in that exact same area. So that's where there are more open jobs than there are qualified people. So if you did a calculation showing what's the relative supply demand ratio, what you actually see is the District of Columbia. So as of, and I'll just kind of read the bullet points. For in the Washington, D.C. area, for every job posting, there are currently 2.2 jobs, people employed in similar fields. Whereas, and that's the DC, that's the far right is an area of focus. So that is actually not where you want to go. The best places to go would be someplace that has a higher number of, or a higher ratio. In this case, your best bet would actually be Texas. Your next best might be, strangely, Florida. And you can see the calculations on the right, which break down the ratios. Any questions? So the 1.0 is actually a bad score, whereas a 3.9 is a better score. And the DC area, I think, if anything, has gotten worse, because this was as of 2021. Okay, what else can we do with this data? Well, as I said and mentioned, you can do visuals, and you can also break it down into different kinds of subspecialties. So what other kinds of jobs might we be referencing for our cybersecurity professionals? Maybe it's a cybersecurity intelligence analyst, or maybe it's other kinds of highly specialized jobs. You can actually scan those, scrape those, and pull external data by competitor and help you build a map of, again, where to go to look for talent or where to avoid, depending on how you stack up in terms of your pay scales, your career pathing, your career development, other kinds of rewards that you have versus, or even your culture versus other competitors. Are they someone you want to steal talent from, or are they someone you want to make sure you're not losing talent to? All right, yet another view of the same kind of cut, and this is a fun one. So, where's the best place to find any kind of talent? This is an example of programmers. I'm going to riff on this just a little bit more. For computer programmers, and we just put in the state of California. This is all external data driven. Labor concentration. Again, you see labor concentration on the horizontal axis, average salary on the vertical axis. So you can see the biggest balls are in San Jose, San Francisco, which is famously known as Silicon Valley. Interestingly, while it's a little hard to read, the big yellow ball is actually Los Angeles. For those of you who may or may not know, Los Angeles in Southern California is actually the largest producer of computer programmer software engineers in the country from its universities. Interestingly, most of them then leave to go to work in San Francisco and San Jose in Silicon Valley. So you can see a huge supply, but reasonable cost, whereas San Francisco is the most expensive. San Jose is only slightly less. Oakland, just across the bay, has a lot of talent, but it's a little less expensive. So where might you want to go to get talent? In this case, we've actually put in a green zone, a green block of the chart. Say that's where your ideal spot. So actually Sacramento or San Diego have really good supply and much lower cost. So those are great places to go to look for talent supply in terms of computer programmers and software engineers. So what else could we do? How else can we look at this? Well, we could rank our cities by the abundance of talent supply and cost, which is kind of what we've been showing in some of the graphics. We can also compare more of those locations. Again, by geometric area. Again, my personal preference is the left side gives you interesting like labor concentration, average salary. When you truly want to get to workforce intelligence, boil it down, keep it simple. And by the way, this fits into part of our theme, which is storytelling. The charts on the left, you can have 20 different charts that look like charts on the left. They're not necessarily going to lead management or HR or anyone else to make a decision. They're not really actionable in terms of the storytelling requirement. They're also not necessarily simple. Is it good information? Absolutely. But what is probably more actionable, it might require a little bit of explanation, maybe a few bullet points, but could you conceivably do it in 1 page or 2 pages? Yes, you could, the chart on the right. That is a way to tell a story. You're putting the most important variables and the size of them, kind of the market in each one. And then from there, you could probably write a few bullet points saying, look, for everyone we hire in this location, we will save on average this much per year. Or the years of experience we normally hire only 2 to 4. We could actually go to this location. We can get people with 5 to 8 years of average experience, which all other things equal should get us a better performance, or certainly more experience and more advanced capabilities, all things considered. Do you know if you're going to get a high performer? Nope. That external data for sort of the high performer rate, where your top talent is going to be, is still hard to, not impossible, but still very hard to do. And you can't get that just using external data services that I know of. I'd love to hear if anyone else has any insights into that. Oh, I love the question by Tamika Hill on union presence or a place to avoid for some jobs. Right. That also gets into your labor environment. Is it either an industry or a geolocation that might be more union heavy, and does that weigh in as a factor? Is that something you care about as a factor? Is that a pro or a con? So for many for-profit organizations, they might consider that a con. Great question and comment. Okay, and I kind of already spoiled this in terms of San Diego and Sacramento is our best place, and here's how much you could save, 20%. All right, now what do you need to be able to do this? Well, so now I've thrown you kind of the solutions, trying to make it look like it's simple, whereas in reality, it's usually not. In order to be able to do this, you would have to be able to pull data, or you have to be able, and some of you may have already done it, pull data from different kinds of sources like USBLS or state or local level data, or Statistics Canada, Statistics UK. There's different kinds of any kind of public supply data. Also, you can scrape demand data, and scraping demand data is where it gets really complicated. So supply data in the US, if you scrape and pull US Bureau of Labor Statistics, Department of Labor data, you can get up to 900, actually just a little bit over 900 jobs and job titles. But one job is really more almost like a job family because it has from junior to senior all in one row. So you can't really get junior accountant, and senior accountant all in the same number. You kind of get the blend. Can you tease that out a little bit? Yes, you can. But it has limits. Whereas if you go to the demand side, does anyone know how many job titles are out there being recruited for at any point in time? Hundreds of thousands. So companies have all kinds of names, I would argue almost pet names for their jobs. So it can be extremely difficult to integrate, standardize, and map all of these job titles that many different competitors and organizations use to call and they put the titles in their recruitings. Sometimes companies have gotten a little bit better. They have a ton, thousands of job titles. When they go to recruit, they may actually not use all of those crazy job titles that they have inside the organization. They may boil it down a little bit to standardize a little bit, but there is not a lot of standardization. In fact, very little standardization in terms of the demand market out there for recruiting for a job, which if you're a candidate, you're someone who's looking for a job, can make it extremely confusing about which job is better, which job. And what do we rely on generally for that? Pay levels. That's it. Or is it senior or level 3 or level 4? Those are the rough rules of thumb that we use. And the challenge that if you're trying to integrate that data is you have to be able to integrate that into a meaningful, what I would argue is a job classification critical role framework. So what kinds of, if it's really a niche job like a cybersecurity analyst, that's pretty easy. But what if it's not? What if it's like supervisors? Well, what kind of supervisor? What even in the BLS data in their job titles, there are many, many different kinds of supervisor titles. So there's industry focus. There's, is it something who's customer facing or not customer facing? There's a lot of complexity involved in that. So integrating, cleansing that data to make it useful does take a bit of work. I guess the point being that it is worth it unless you can buy it all curated. So if you can buy it all already done for you, that might actually be a worthwhile investment. And then what can you do with it? So this is just some simple categorization around workforce categories. You can say, STEM, scientific, technical type staff. What are technology companies hiring, and how much do they need? So you can see some of the top demand, top supply, where is most of it at? This is what's called a workforce image map, or WIM for short, which can be utilized to compare the incidence and impact of workforce intervention. So it's always important to keep in mind the context of how many do we have. Again, the example of the cybersecurity analyst, you can make exceptions for that because it's a relatively small group, unless you happen to be a cybersecurity firm, in which case it's a big group. But typically it's a smaller subset within your IT, like literally only one department or two departments in your IT organization. Whereas if we're talking about sales or IT professionals, then we have to start branching it out into a lot of different skill sets. But what is the relative incidence, meaning how large is our IT group? And then within that, how much is the support or the specific groups that we're talking about? Same thing with professional staff. What's professional staff? That might be accountants. That might be attorneys. That might be quality control. It could be engineers. Or engineers would actually probably be in scientific and technical staff. Could be HR professionals. So it could be a lot of different groups that that are professional staff but don't qualify in the STEM category. Operations staff typically touching product or providing services in terms of logistics, and then specialists in other kinds of positions. What else can we do with this? Okay, so getting toward the end, another example of what you can do. So how can we use this to make really advanced decisions and action it? What we need to do is simply put together a model, which has been done here. Because one of the questions is always, so if you're going to blend all this external data we've been talking a lot about with your internal data, do we build, buy, or contract? Do we build, buy, or rent our talent? So you can build a model which actually gives you some scenarios you can do into the future. You can pick a future-based year and have it tell you what's the best. Is it better to rent the talent? Should we get contractors? At what rate, and what skill set, and what's the availability of that talent? We're using our external supply to do that. Or should we hire it because we found some great locations like Fargo, North Dakota, and Raleigh, Durham, North Carolina to get great talent, or Oakland, California. We found some great locations where we can get some really expensive jobs at less expensive rates, or perhaps Northern Ireland, or perhaps Dublin, or perhaps London, UK. So lots of different options relative to what you can get. And then the idea with that is to forecast our needs going forward. And that should give you an idea of how many do we need now, and how many will we need tomorrow, and 1 year, and 2 years, and 3 years, and 5 years, and what do we forecast as job or wage inflation rates in these different locations. And that can give us the ability to actually project some pretty significant cost savings if we're making smart decisions now that will pay off over time, because growing talent is like planting a tree. The big ROI doesn't come right away. It takes time to build up, like a tree that's going to give you shade for your home. So with that, let me pause and see if we have any questions.